Hello students, Mr. John here, and welcome to Chapter 7, Lesson 2. We're picking up where we left off with Sparta. Where we left off, you had the Hellenes culture starting to form. You had city-states forming. They were ruled by kings. However, these Hellenic kings are overthrown by nobles, and that's kind of where we're at. So how do we go from these city-states being run by nobles to these sort of idyllic Western democracies that we're always, basically romanticized about, and, where Western culture began? We're going to talk about that today. In addition, we're going to talk about perhaps two of the most famous city-states of ancient Greece. You've got Athens and Sparta. So we're going to talk more in depth on those. Just quickly, when you do a Google image search of Sparta, the first thing to come up right here, a statue of a warrior. Things like this, right here, soldiers fighting. That's what you get when you get with Sparta. Now you do Athens, you get this, and this. It's almost like a shining city on a hill. So this should give you an idea of what the two cities are about. Is anyone else getting a pretty different vibe here? It's a pretty major difference. You've got Sparta, you've got Athens. So we're going to learn about them as soon as we make the jump. Alright, so we have the city-states growing. After the Dark Ages of Greece, you have more food, growing populations, increased trade. Things are going well. Wealthy nobles had seized power from the kings of old. The problem for these nobles, however, is that two groups of people are unhappy. Pretty much everyone but them. Farmers had borrowed money from nobles to buy land, you see, and they could not pay it back. Nobles sometimes took their land and sometimes enslaved the farmers that were in debt. So this is actually seems to be something that happens a lot in ancient societies. The farmers go in debt, and then they're like most of the population, and they do not get happy with that. The next group was merchants and artisans. So because merchants and artisans didn't own land, they owned businesses. They weren't allowed to take part in the political process. Typically, you have to be a native landowning male to partake. So despite the fact that they were doing well financially, they didn't have any political power, and they did not like that. They did not like being excluded from the political process. So now you have the angry farmers and angry merchants and artisans. So what's going to happen? Well, the growing unrest among the farming class and the middle class of these artisans and merchants basically led to the overthrow of noble rule throughout city-states in roughly the 650s BC. Unfortunately, what they put in the stead of the nobles was a tyrant, which is a single man in charge with total authority. Now, people think tyrant now, and they think bad, but it wasn't always bad. A lot of the tyrants, single people in charge, were actually pretty fair. It was only a few bad apples that really gave the word tyrant its negative connotation. So this was about 100 years. You get to about the year 500 BC, and most of the city-states end up not being a tyranny anymore, but either an oligarchy with a few wealthy people in charge, or a democracy where the citizens share in control of the government. Depending on which one they were, democracy or oligarchy, their cities developed very differently. Let's get into an oligarchy, that is Sparta, and then we'll get into Athens, which ends up being a democracy. So Sparta is located on the Peloponnesus Peninsula, which is this little chunk right here that's almost totally its own island, only thinly attached to the rest of Greece. Sparta, where is it? There it is. Instead of, having growing populations and needing to spread out, and they didn't do colonies. They just conquered the neighboring city-states and people around, and they made all these people that they conquered become helots. Helots are the laborers in Sparta, and they do all the farming, they do the work, and this leaves native-born Spartan men for the sole purpose of war. Back in 650 BC, you see there was a Helot uprising. So they'd gone around and conquered their neighbors, more or less enslaved the people to become the laborers, the Helots. And the Helots had an uprising. They didn't like being under control. It was beaten back, but after this, the Spartans decided that their society was basically going to be based on the military and martial prowess. So here's what they end up with, this very militaristic society. Boys at the age of 7 are sent to the agoge, which is like basically boot camp from the age of 7 to 20. It was best described as brutal. I actually linked in a video here. Kids were basically taught everything military and sort of conditioned for warfare. They wouldn't be fed enough. They'd get severely punished if they were caught stealing. They weren't punished for stealing. They were punished for being caught. They thought this would help them on the battlefield. They learned weapons. They learned military songs. All these things to condition them for war, basically from early childhood all the way through adulthood. When they turned 20, they completed their training and entered active military service. They were free to marry at 20, but they couldn't live at home until they're 30. And there were other rights that they got when they were at 30, like in government. If they lived to 60, they would be able to retire from active military service. So since the men were constantly away, either they were under the age of 30 and didn't live at home, or they were off on military campaigns or training. So as a result, women were actually afforded more rights and opportunities than typical Greek women, because they had to, because the men were away constantly. They were also expected to stay fit and took part in sports and training and things like that. The thought was if you had a strong woman could have strong Spartan baby boys. And they needed to have strong Spartan baby boys to keep their size up. Let's see. The Spartan government was an oligarchy. They had 2 kings, but they were really just figureheads that led the army and performed religious ceremonies. Basically, if one king was away fighting, there'd still be another king around to do his duties. There were 2 governing bodies, the Assembly and the Council of Elders. The Assembly consisted of all Spartan males over the age of 30. It's an important age. And they decided whether or not to go to war. But the most powerful governing body was the Council of Elders. The council made decisions on executions, exiling people, things like that. They also appointed 5 ephors yearly to enforce laws and collect taxes. The government of Sparta was strict and brought stability to the city-state, but at a cost. They were afraid of another Helot uprising and strictly limited any new ideas coming into Sparta. Very few visitors were allowed in, and you really weren't allowed to leave unless you were on military business. So they didn't really travel. They even discouraged things like literature and the arts within their borders. This, what I've called mental stagnancy, caused Sparta to fall behind the rest of Greece. Basically, there were no technological or cultural advancements, and as a result, well, Sparta fell behind. They use an example in the book where they used their currency were these heavy iron bars where everyone else started coining money, and then people didn't want to trade with them because they have to lug around these heavy currency. They remained a somewhat poor farming society with a flat standard of living. Basically, things just didn't really improve there. They didn't seem to care, though, because what mattered to them was victory. And victory they would indeed have when Greece was forced to unite to fight the Persian horde. We'll learn about that in the next lesson. Let's switch to Athens, what I'm calling a city on a hill. Look at how glorious it looks. Athens was a different sort of city. Instead of being educated in war at age 7, boys were educated in arithmetic, drawing, the arts, even public speaking. When they finished school at 18, they were expected to play an active role in public affairs. Women ran the home and educated their daughters to do the same. They learned skills like spinning and weaving. Wealthy women were taught to read and write, and some learned to play instruments. But all in all, women did not really take part in government or business within Athens. They were sort of your typical housewife. Much like other city-states, by around 600 BC, there were problems with the farmers. Basically, the nobles ruled, and all the farmers owed them lots of money. Uh, this wasn't good because the farmers were pretty mad about it, and they were reaching a boiling point. So the nobles turned to a man named Solon. Solon was a respected merchant in Athens, and he had a plan to fix this problem. He freed any enslaved farmers and forgave them, well, all the farmers of all their debts. So if you had a debt, it was forgiven. If you were enslaved because you were in debt, you were freed, and then your debt forgiven. He then opened the courts and assembly, sort of their lower legislative branch, to all male citizens. This was a great start, but did not go far enough for some. By the time of his death, Solon was rather disliked. You see, the rich people, the nobles, didn't like him because he gave all these rights to the poor people. And the poor people got mad because they didn't think he had gone far enough. You know, people were happy with people sort of in the middle. Alright, the next name, I want to make sure I pronounce it correctly. Pisistratus. After he was a relative of Solon, and after Solon died, he took reforms even further. He went so far as to break up large estates into little sections and giving that land to the poor people. He was the one that started the active worship of Athena in Athens, which makes sense. He had the poor construct temples for Athena. Basically, he went even further in making sure that the farming class was happy and provided them jobs with this temple and public works construction. After his death, reforms continued even further. A new ruler by the name of, I want to say it, Cleisthenes. He made the assembly the major governing body of Athens. Basically, he took his power and surrendered it to this legislature. And remember, the assembly, even poor farmers could be in the assembly. He also created a brand new council of 500 where members basically ran the everyday operations of the government, but it wasn't democratic, it was a lottery. So basically a random 500 people every year would have this government job. Even though Athens, through these series of succeeding rulers, became more and more democratic, it was still somewhat exclusive in that only men native to Athens had any say in the process, so you didn't have any women. Anyone that had moved into Athens from somewhere else, and of course slaves, didn't have any rights. So there you have it. Let's bump to our assignment real quick. Simple question. Hey, would you have rather been born in Athens or Sparta? Now, I remember doing this assignment last year, and I had a total variety of answers, and a lot of it depends on whether or not you're a boy or a girl. If you're a boy, you basically get to choose between being an elite soldier or a well-educated member of society. And if you're a girl, so in that way, I mean, a lot of the boys chose Athens because they didn't want to go through the Agoge. But Spartan women end up having more rights and a lot more freedom because the men are away all the time. So you wouldn't, be subjugated to just being, basically a housewife and a baby maker. But then you have the risk of, when your baby is born in Sparta, would they throw your baby over a hillside because they had a funny birthmark or something? What if they were scrawny or too fat? They might throw your baby over a cliff. You don't have to worry about that in Athens, but in Athens, you will just be a housewife. So the answer is really dependent on a number of factors. It was very interesting reading this assignment last year, and I'm looking forward to reading it again this year. So that's your assignment. Make sure you give me your answer. I would rather have been born in Athens. I would have rather been born in Sparta. And then 2 reasons. Well, I want to grow up and have lots of kids, and I don't want them thrown over a cliff. Also, I don't like the idea of my husband being a soldier and maybe dying. That would be pretty lame. Oh, there you go. Great answer. I would rather have been born in Athens because I'm a lover, not a fighter. And in Sparta, I would have to have been a soldier, and I don't like that. And I would rather learn about geometry and be a politician. Boom. Good answer. So it'll probably be about a paragraph. It's 10 points. There's no right or wrong answer. The only way you can lose points is not writing enough. So always err on the side of writing more. That's it. Hey, if you have any questions,